Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one of our webinars. Thank you very much for joining us today. If this is your first time attending our webinars, we do these regularly on a monthly basis. We cover a variety of topics across all three areas that we manage, which you may know to be residential, commercial, and body corporate management. And as always, we do welcome any suggestion of topics that you may have. We're going to start our webinar very shortly. We're just waiting for everybody to log on. I see those numbers are going up quite quickly. Whilst we wait for that, today's webinar is a focus on commercial property management, specifically a brief overview of the differences between residential and commercial properties and some important aspects of commercial property management that every discerning investor should be aware of. We're going to start our presentation today with a slide overview, which is going to be followed with a more detailed Q&A session with our commercial property manager, James, who I'll introduce you to a little bit later. And as per usual, as mentioned, we are recording this session. You will be sent a link to this recording, so please feel free to send through any questions you have throughout the webinar. And we'll attend to these at the very end. So our numbers are looking very good. I think let's just go straight into it. So we're going to start with the basics of commercial property management. What is a commercial property? So a commercial property is one that is used for business activities such as retail, office, warehouse, and industrial facilities, as well as educational and medical facilities. In some instances, these may also include larger buildings used for accommodation, such as Airbnb and service departments, hotels, even mixed-use buildings where the property includes retail, offices, and apartments. So in other words, a commercial property is any entity that attracts GST. Commercial real estate, or CRE, is a very different type of risk, but potentially a high reward asset class. So often commercial investment properties will require a larger deposit and mortgage rates will be higher than residential rates. In general, commercial real estate can attract high returns with slightly higher risks, and deposit and lending requirements will be different from residential. And of course, it's always best to seek professional advice. And in this instance, that would be a mortgage broker. So compared to residential tenancies, commercial tenancies are more structured. They can have longer term tenures, and the rent arrears scenarios differ to residential. For example, a month's default in residential could be $2,000, but in commercial could be upwards of $20,000. So let's have a look at some of the common commercial terms used. We've got quite a few here. Okay, so we'll start off, I'm going to do it in a slightly different order. So we'll start off with rental square meterage. This is the amount of space inside the office or building being rented and the space that the tenant is actually occupying within the facility. Right of first refusal. The landlord is required to offer any additional space to the current tenant before offering it to the general public. Shared common area. A portion of the total square meterage that is shared with other tenants, for example, bathrooms located in hallways, reception areas, on-site gyms, elevators, and cafeterias. 4 and 5, deed of lease, OPEX, and BWOF. I'm going to drill down into those in much more detail in the following slides. So then we'll pop on to the last one, which is making good. And this happens generally at the end of lease, and it's where one is required to return the property to its original state. So let's pop into deed of lease. This is the most important document when it comes to commercial properties. It determines and governs the relationship between the property owner and the tenants. It is written in accordance with the Property Law Act and is a template provided by the and is a template provided by the Auckland District Law Society and most commonly used industry-wide. as I said, governs the relationship between the owner and the tenants. It will also determine the terms and conditions for the tenant. For example, the rent, length of lease, OPEX contributions, and also includes rent review timing and end of lease obligations. So here's an important area. What is the difference between an agreement to lease and a deed of lease? So the agreement to lease sets out the broad commercial terms, for example, the right of renewal, rent reviews, etc. The deed of lease incorporates the commercial terms from the agreement to lease and then also provides details about the day-to-day operations of the lease. For example, what are the obligations to maintain the premises? What is required to alter the premises, or what happens at the end of lease? Here's an important area, rent reviews. So let me just pop through to the end. There we go. So rent reviews, a rent review clause in the deed of lease provides the parties the ability to increase their premises rent to reflect that property's current market value. So the objective of rent review clause is to balance the rent with changes in the value of money and property market throughout a lease. Rent review clauses are not compulsory for commercial leases in New Zealand, and if they are included in the lease, may be compulsory or optional. So optional means that the owner may discharge the review at their discretion. Each lease may vary, highlighting the importance of familiarizing yourself with the clauses in your deed of lease. The most common methods of rent review. First one here, market rent review, compares the price of rent for the premises with the current market rates for properties of a similar standard, size, location, and usage at the time of rent review. This usually requires a professional and independent valuation of the property. A ratchet clause may be included in a lease, which dictates that rent can only increase and may never decrease despite the property market's movements. So that's a ratchet clause. Secondly, in terms of rent reviews, we look at CPI, which is Consumer Price Index. And this is the measure of inflation published quarterly by Statistics New Zealand. And when reviewed, the rent will either increase or decrease as per the rate of inflation. Lastly, fixed percentage increase rent review. This is where the rent is increased at specific percentages specified in the deed of lease on specified review dates. Let me say that again, where the rent is increased at specific percentages specified in the deed of lease on specified review dates. So for example, your rent will increase by 5% every 12 to 24 months. Let's have a look now at OPEX. So OPEX stands for operating expenses, and it's based on the square meterage if there is more than one tenant in the building, for example, a shopping centre. Water and power meters should be separate to ensure easy reading and fair charges to each tenant for consumption. So I've just seen a question to see if it's right. Okay, we'll carry on. As I said, if you've got any questions, we will answer those at the end. So please do keep them coming through. So let's carry on with OPEX. So the tenant pays OPEX with rent to the property manager or owner, who then pays out the operating expenses directly to relevant suppliers and contractors, and this is best practice. So OPEX is different to capital expense, which is CapEx. And a very good example of CapEx versus OPEX in commercial property. CapEx is the resurface of a car park, whereas OPEX will be the repairs and maintenance, for example, fixing of potholes. Generally, CapEx is an owner cost and OPEX would be a tenant cost. So let's run into another important area, which is our building warrant of fitness. Or BWOF. This is legally required under the Building Act and is monitored by local government. An annual certificate must be obtained and displayed at front of building. And essentially a BWOF it ensures that all mechanical essential facilities are maintained to specific standards. For example, automatic doors, fire signs, extraction units. heating or cooling systems, escalator lifts, and sprinkler systems. Right, so commercial property manager. What does a commercial property manager do for you? So there are a number of areas in which a commercial property manager is an expert. And the first of these would be conflict management and communication between owners and tenants. A commercial property manager collects rent from tenants and follows a specific arrears policy, does regular property inspections, and at these will do those preventative maintenance checks. Will hire contractors to service the property. Specifically here, we need to mention economies of scale. So most commercial property management companies will have a number of properties that they service and will pass on the discounts and other benefits to our clients. So lease management, we aim for 100% occupancy. Property manager will also assist with compliance, BWAF, building warrant of fitness, health and safety, and of course fire systems. Financial administration, we operate a trust account that is independently audited, OPEX reconciliations and recovery, budget planning, and annual wash-ups. So the last of my slide here, just giving you that basic overview of commercial property investment, is just really looking at the responsibilities. So owner versus tenant, who is responsible for what? This is the area where most conflict may happen between owners and tenants, making it very important to ensure that the deed of lease is thorough in listing each entity's responsibilities and obligations. So let's have a look at the owner. The owner is responsible for building structural maintenance, and in terms of insurance, the owner is obliged to ensure that cover is in place. However, in most instances, the cost will fall under OPEX and therefore the tenant. Tenant retention starts with communication, preventative maintenance checks, replacing minor items each year in order to keep a fresh appearance. So let's pop quickly into tenant obligations. Of course, the first of these is to ensure that OPEX obligations are met as laid out in the deed of lease. And most importantly, keeps up to date with annual BWAF checks and certification, performs regular health and safety audits, as well as ensuring that the fire system is compliant. So that should give you a really decent understanding of commercial property investment. Just really, as I said, going over the basics. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to James Bangerter, who's our commercial property management team leader. As a reminder, again, any questions that you have, we'll attend to at the very end if we have some time. And if we run out, of course, we can always answer you directly on those. So welcome, James. You have a wealth of property management knowledge and experience from working in both residential and commercial property sectors across a variety of platforms, including property maintenance, new business development, and general management. So
yes, I do. Is that the first question?
No, that's just
that's
just us saying how amazing you are and yeah, where you come from. So
yeah, I mean, I have been a property manager both in residential and commercial. So I know this webinar is focusing mainly on the difference between the two. So I think I'm qualified enough to be able to compare the two and what the different property managers of both sections do. So yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. So that brings us to our very first question, and that is the difference between commercial and residential properties. So what would you say are the biggest differences? I
guess the biggest difference is, besides the obvious, that the residential is somewhere where somebody lives, and the commercial is somewhere that people run their livelihood from. The commercial lease, I guess, or the commercial tenancy tends to be more structured, and the main thing with that is the length of tenure. So you know, some leases can obviously they can be as short as 1 year, 2 years, but they can stretch out far longer than that, you know, to 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So I guess that's one major concerns for residential landlords, is that continuance of tenancy and having occupancy at 100%. That's the advantage, big advantage with commercial properties, is you can get those long tenures of, like I said, anything up to 30 years. One of those benefits.
In terms of the conditions of lease, would you say that there's more flexibility on the commercial side as opposed to residential?
I think that there is the ability to, with a commercial lease, to set out those things at the beginning of the lease. And so the leases are more structured and talk about how the relationship is going to go forward, you know, throughout that long tenure.
Yeah. Okay. All right, good. Well, I mean, that really sort of, I think one other area potentially where there would be a big difference would be making changes to the actual property, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it will. As we know, the tenants in a residential property, they're not supposed to make changes without asking the owner's permission throughout the tenancy. A big thing that obviously that in a commercial is the landlord provides the structure, let's say. So a lot of the time it's just a shell of a building, and the tenant is fitting it out. So they're actually obviously running their business from there. They want it set out how they want it. So it starts off as a shell. It becomes a restaurant, or it becomes a group of offices. So they're adding to that, which is a lot different than in a residential situation.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next area. Where do you see most deeds of lease fall over?
I think it's the big one that we see as property managers is just that clarity around who's going to do what, and that's generally around maintenance. So whose responsibility is it to repair something within the building or repair something on the outside of the building? So there's kind of a rule of thumb that the landlord looks after the structure and the services that come to the building, and the tenant looks after the minor repairs to the items that are in there, especially the ones that they've introduced into the property, obviously. And it can spell out in the lease when something happens in a specific situation, who pays for that. Now, you mentioned that the template that we use is the Auckland District Law Society deed of lease, and that will spell out in very legal speak terms who pays for what. But when we come across leases that experienced landlords have had drawn up and experienced tenants have had drawn up, and it goes well beyond that template. So there's lots of added clauses where you want to be really specific about certain things that are in that property, because all properties are different. So
for example, maybe a heating or cooling system that requires an annual service, or
and you need while that may seem obvious, to avoid any arguments around that, you can spell it out as strongly as you want in the deed, so that everybody is really, really clear. And then that makes the life of a property manager easier, but it makes the life of the landlord and the tenant a lot easier, because you just go back to the deed of lease and you can have a look. If you're just relying on the initial template, sometimes it can be a little bit grey, and then it comes down to interpretation, and you can have multiple people with different interpretations of that.
Okay. So just on that then to ensure that no misunderstanding occurs, how do we do that? Obviously, it's got to go through a solicitor.
I think, you know, it's very similar to the Residential Tenancies Act when you're dealing with a residential property. You can't put something in a residential tenancy agreement that falls outside of the law or the RTA.
Yeah.
Very similar in commercial because we're relying on the Property Law Act. So you may come to an agreement between both parties.
Yeah.
You and I may be a landlord and a tenant.
Yeah.
And we may see the common sense in something, so we want it written up in a deed of lease. But we just want to make sure, we just want to pass it by a solicitor to make sure that we're not agreeing to something that falls outside of that property law.
Okay. Okay. So we're not doing something like wholly illegal, or we were like allowed to.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
and you just
Yeah.
and
Okay.
sometimes solicitors will point out that, hey, look, that's not going to work if
Yeah.
something happens. So
Right.
getting a solicitor, I know it costs money, but getting a solicitor to make sure that the deed of lease is written up correctly is very important.
And again, I think you mentioned this earlier, the fact that a deed of lease can cover such a long period of time, to make sure that it's 100%, accurate and set up properly in the beginning, will saves you a lot of headache, doesn't it?
And it can be varied throughout the life of it. You can do deeds of variation where, because things change. We know last year there was a lot of changes to the commercial landscape, people's businesses, and things that suited prior to COVID don't necessarily suit post-COVID. So, that's an example where you might, at the next renewal, want to look at a few things and vary it. So as long as both parties agree, you can do a deed of variation and just change it.
Okay. All right. So do-it-yourself commercial property owners, where do you see the most common areas that they have trouble with?
The things that we see when properties come to us and we're asked to be property managers, and the landlord has been managing the property themselves, the most common things that we see is, I guess, lease renewals, but more so rent reviews haven't been followed through with that were in the lease. There may be a legitimate reason for that. There may have been an agreement, but sometimes it's just that the lease has gone in someone's bottom drawer and they kind of haven't kept an eye on it.
Yeah. So they miss those dates.
They miss those dates.
Okay.
So, we use a system, our software system enables us to put those into a schedule, and they come up and we're able to start that discussion when that discussion is needed.
Yeah.
There's a time that you start talking about renewals and talking about rent reviews, and there's a real process around that. So I guess that process with some landlords hasn't always been followed.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's one of the common ones. Not going beyond the agreement to lease, that's quite common. Some people will do the agreement to lease and not do a deed of lease.
Okay.
And in some occasions that's safe and fine, and the relationship is good throughout the whole tenure of the tenancy. But it's always a good idea to have that deed of lease, like we've talked about earlier. And it's quite common for landlords just to do the agreement to lease. One of the reasons for that, besides the fact that it's not a long and detailed document, it's a bit shorter, it's a little bit easier to understand. The fact is that a leasing agent can create one of those. It's kind of like your proposal from the tenant to the landlord. Hey, this is what I would like the tenancy to look like, and it makes up part of the leasing agent's cost. It's not free, but it's incorporated in that cost. Whereas a deed of lease, you have to employ a solicitor to do that, and of course, everybody knows as soon as a solicitor picks up a phone or answers a text, it costs you. So there is that cost, but it will potentially save you money in the long run. Yeah, making sure that deed of lease is in place. So that's another common one that we see.
So just quickly on not following through with the deed of lease. Obviously, potentially a landlord would want to be trying to save money by not going and doing the deed of lease. However, if we look at a long-term contract and we end up in a point where there's a dispute, that could potentially cost just as much or more money than not having spent money.
Yeah, because you're going to take a long time to interpret what was meant in the agreement to lease.
Yep.
And if it's something that's a disagreement, a dispute, it's going to take a while for all parties to come to an agreement, and it'll 9 times out of 10 end up with a solicitor or even in disputes tribunal, and it's going to cost extra money. So probably that investment early on is a better idea than waiting for that potential larger cost.
The cost then.
Yeah.
Okay. What else? What other areas? Oh, so we're also looking at multiple tenants where do-it-yourself owners might struggle.
Yeah, I just think that's just the, not necessarily struggle, but just the time involved to do that.
Yep.
You know, multiple tenants sharing operating expense costs. Those tenants change in a complex where you've got a number of units. The type of tenant changes and their contribution to the OPEX might change. If you base it solely on square meterage and a percentage, it's a little bit easier, but then some things that are of a common use, one tenant may use it more. And so, you know, you've got to think about all of those things. So just that managing of that shared operating expense, doing the budget properly, making sure that direct recovery invoice, those are the ones that are specific to that tenant and aren't shared, are sent promptly and recovered. Yep. Getting all of that right. You know, and here at Auckland Property Management, we use an accountant, a very experienced accountant, to do that, because it is so.
Absolutely. So we use someone of experience who can just come in and
So I mean, we've got landlords obviously that would be accountants and quite capable of doing it, but they should be spending their time doing their job and making money, and have somebody doing that type of thing for them.
Totally. And in fact, we say in residential property management, and I'm sure it applies in commercial property management, that a landlord or an owner, their time has a value to it. You know, and why are you spending this time when you could get somebody of experience to? Yeah,
and then getting the wash ups, and that's another term in commercial that we use, that people that aren't experienced with commercial investment would be aware of, and that's wash up. So that's basically, in a budgeted situation, the tenants have been contributing a certain amount of money, and obviously there's expenses that you've budgeted, and at the end of the year you wash it all up. So they contributed a certain amount, it wasn't enough for the expenses for that year, and they therefore need to pay some more at the end of the year,
right?
Or they pay too much, and you need to reimburse them. So that's called washing up, and again, that's complex and takes time, and some people might just put that off. And then it becomes a bit more difficult if you've left it for another year. So washing up every year at the end of the financial year is something that
very good. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. When we're looking at vacant commercial properties, how can we assist owners?
Well, we're a property management company. We don't do leasing. We specialise in managing the property. So we rely on using leasing agents to find tenants for us, for the properties, for our clients' properties, and they're specialists. So I've worked in residential property management companies alongside sales agents. Sales agents and leasing agents, commercial leasing agents, commercial sales agents are a type of person. They're very good at what they do. They're salespeople, they're real estate people, and they're a different type of person than a property manager. It's the same in residential, it's the same in commercial. So we rely on the leasing agents that we've recognised are good in their field. Because we're independent, we can go out there and choose them. So we've got a number of leasing agents that we have relationships with, and they work for multiple different brands.
Right.
And the reason why we've chosen them is because they're the leaders in that area. So
Right.
suburb or type of commercial building. They use their expertise. They use their databases that they have.
Very important. Yeah.
They know who's looking. They know who's looking for what.
Yeah.
And so we use them. They're also able to create the agreement to lease, and they're also able to work through the Anti-Money Laundering Act.
Ah, very important.
And how, yeah.
So again, as a property manager, it's really just outsourcing in those very specific areas and finding the people that have expertise.
Finding that, but also keeping them honest as well. At the moment, the market is very active. There are a lot of people downsizing from bigger properties down into smaller. However, they've been affected by COVID. Some people have expanded. Some people have done well out of the environment. So they're looking at bigger properties. So there is quite a bit of activity. It started up again probably at the end of 2020, where that activity started coming back. And you know, we want to be able to take advantage of that. So they are, you know, it's worth using those
cars. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, just quickly on a little legal change. There's been a change in notice periods for arrears. So what has happened there?
This is something that's impacted because of COVID, and you need to know it as a landlord in commercial, understanding that process. We talked about it, only touched on it briefly right at the beginning, that the arrears management is quite a bit different in commercial property management than it is with residential.
Yeah.
The residential arrears management it's not easier, but it's more structured. So it's more, you know, it's almost a day-to-day process, whereas commercial is a little bit different, and you need to, again, to do it properly, you need to get solicitors involved in regards to notices and doing it properly.
So there's a specific notice?
Yeah, so it generally, when the relationship has fallen down completely and the tenant needs to go, but they don't want to go, and they've just generally stopped paying rent or stopped paying operating expenses, and it's got to that point, a PLA, what we call a PLA notice, is issued. Okay. And it used to be a 10-day PLA notice. The government has increased that to 30-day notice.
Wow.
It gives the opportunity for tenants that may be struggling because of what's happened, just a little bit of extra time to be able to remedy.
Yeah, and kind of bounce back and
yeah. So it's just a bit of a longer bit of time. That's all. And solicitors need to understand that, and property managers and landlords need to know that as well.
Yeah.
You don't want to be issuing an incorrect notice.
No, definitely not. Okay. All right. In terms of our management fees, who pays for us? Who pays our management fees?
It's a good question. Ultimately, it's one of two people. It's either the landlord or it's the tenant.
Yeah.
If you have a look at the standard lease, there's a section there that outlines the outgoings. So it has a list of the common type of outgoings: land rates, insurance, and so on.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's limited to those, but one of those main one is recognised as management fees. So it comes under an OPEX, an operating expense.
Yeah.
So ultimately the tenant, as long as that is listed as an operating expense in their lease, the tenant pays for it.
Okay, so that's commonly the tenant pays.
It's the most common thing that the tenants pay for it. It's not 100% of the time. A lot of the time, an owner may pay it, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Some leases or some renters is what we call a gross rent. So a tenant just pays gross rent, and the landlord has taken into account all of the expenses that they're going to incur,
Okay.
like the land rates, like the management fee, like body corporate fees, insurance, those types of things.
How often is gross rent used? Or is it a specific
It's
property?
not as common, but
Okay.
some tenants like it because they know how much the gross rent has been set, and then it's not going to be reviewed for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. And during that time, operating expense might increase. The landlord has to take that into consideration if they're going to enter into a gross rent scenario.
Yeah.
And you would factor in the cost of the management fee in that.
Okay.
But the most common way is to charge the tenant on a monthly basis as an operating expense.
Okay.
If it's in there. The other reason why landlords will pay it is because they may have been managing the property themselves.
Okay.
Now they're handing it to a property manager.
Big
And the
surprise to the
property,
tenants.
the property manager obviously wants to get paid.
Yeah.
And the landlord may not want to impact that tenant. They're a good tenant. They don't want to impact their outgoing costs.
Yeah.
So the landlord has an agreement with us that they'll pay the management fee until that tenant moves out and a new one is introduced.
Right.
Even though with that tenant moving out, the tenant that's moving out has in their lease that they are to pay management fees. It's a good idea not to cross that out if you're going to self-manage, because you may want to get it managed in the future by someone, and if it's there, you're legally able to do it.
Okay.
I would strongly suggest if you're going to enter into a lease, you talk about the management fee and just say, hey, look, presently I'm going to manage the property myself, but in the future I may want to introduce a property manager, so I'm going to leave that open. You're just taking advantage of the fact that I'm not going to charge that to you now, but in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, you just bear in mind you may need to pay that.
And it just gives the landlord options, doesn't it?
It gives the landlord option.
Yeah.
It's also easier for the property manager who's comes along and says to the tenant, hey, we're now going to be charging a management fee.
Yeah. And
It's an extra cost. So, yeah.
All right. So what areas in tenant management can potentially become rather difficult?
Oh, a number of things. That's a really good one.
So, I mean, obviously, this probably relates more specifically to multiple tenants, wouldn't it?
Yeah, multiple tenants adds just another level of complexity because, like I said before, some tenants believe that they're not utilising something that is common as much as another tenant.
Yeah.
And the easiest way we feel and the fairest way is to base it on square meterage. There is an argument that's not necessarily fair, but it's normally the most common way to do it. But there might be something that a tenant feels, well, they don't utilise that. You can identify something like a lift that goes to the first floor, and there's only one tenant up there. That's obvious that they're the only ones really that are going to pay for that. But there's other things that come into it, and it's really recognising those and potentially there can be a little bit of dispute over those types of things. So that's one of the difficulties with. So
if we're looking at a shopping centre and we've got an anchor tenant that's obviously can afford quite a bit because they are a larger entity, and then we've got a whole bunch of little guys, then it would be looking at the sharing of costs there and making sure that it's
they might want something introduced, for instance, that the anchor tenant or another tenant feels that it's an advantage, and yes it is, but these other tenants are running, their profitability might not be as much. They might not have the cash flow to be able to afford something like that. So those things we tend to, when we've got multiple tenants, have tenancy meetings where we can talk about that across the table, and you can come up with an agreement. So it's not really a problem. It's just an extra complexity that you have to deal with. Yeah.
I didn't know about the tenancy meetings, so that's really good. So you have like regular communications and
yeah, if you're brave enough to have that. So that's where you're looking for good tenants that are reasonable and want to bring some ideas to the table as well, and a lot of the time, those tenants, they're sharing an area and they're sharing benefits. They're bringing customers. One client is bringing customers to an area, and the other tenant is taking advantage of that, and vice versa. So they've got a vested interest in working together. So it's good to get everybody together. And talk as kind of like a tenant unit, and that's a job of the property manager to facilitate that.
Good. Next area is compliance. So we've got three. We've mentioned in the slide presentation, I mentioned 3 specific areas of compliance, which is BWOF, fire systems, and health and safety. What can you add to that? Just in terms of how we can assist and who's responsible?
Well, first of all, there's reasons why those things are there. And, the residential landlords are now experienced. We didn't have that type of compliance stuff for residential rental properties. And that's impacted residential landlords quite strongly. But eventually everybody will be used to that. Commercial landlords are already used to it because there's a lot of compliance that has been in place. And those are the building warrant of fitness, those are the fire systems, and those are those health and safety compliance situation, and that's come more and more to the fore over the last 5 years since the Act was changed in 2016, where the Workplace Health and Safety Act came into place, and everybody was then became aware that we all share the responsibility. We call it the PCBUs. So the landlord, the tenant, the contractor, all share that responsibility when customers or contractors, property managers, the landlord themselves, the tenant themselves are in that property. We all fall under the Workplace Health and Safety Act. So health and safety is very, very important in the practical sense. Even if that act wasn't there, it makes sense to keep people safe. It's a bit like smoke alarms. So we can, as property managers, recognise health and safety issues. So can a landlord, so can a tenant. But what if we miss something? So it's really important that health and safety reports for properties are done. We highly recommend them because they're an advantage for insuring the property. It highlights things. It's keeping people safe. And for the investment, the outlay to get those health and safety plans in place can potentially save you a lot of money at the end of the day. Right? People still get hurt.
Oh, absolutely. People.
But if we've all done what we're supposed to do and reduce that risk of people getting hurt, when WorkSafe come and check it out, as long as everybody's done everything that they should do, and one of those things is paying for a health and safety report, then there's less chance of being held responsible.
Okay, so the cost of liability then falls back onto WorkSafe. Is that how it works?
Well, no, it's just that, hey, look, it's investigated and you'll see it in the news all the time. And our health and safety officer here at Auckland Property Management shows us examples of workplace incidents that hit the news and people held responsible financially. And they're massive payouts, some of them. So those health and safety reports, us being able to give those to contractors that are so they're aware of health and safety issues. We're also making sure that they have health and safety policies as well. So there's that real responsibility by us, and making sure that the BWOFs are in place. as well, and that's an annual check. And like you said before, the actual certificate needs to be displayed so everybody knows this place has been checked and the mechanical systems through here are working properly as they should, and the fire checks. That's
so does the commercial property manager, is it part of his responsibilities then to ensure that these compliance things are in place, although the cost, right? Okay.
I mean, that's our management agreement. I mean, we're saying to the landlord, hey, look, it's part of our responsibility to make sure these things are kept. So
that's really us helping the landlord reduce risks. Really, isn't it?
It's not that we do them ourselves. We obviously employ people that do the checks. That they have to be a qualified certified person that goes and does the checking. Yeah. Okay. My very last question: what happens when we have a lease terminating? What happens there? There's obviously a number of times when that happens.
Yeah.
So obviously the end or the final expiry of a lease, that doesn't necessarily mean that the tenant has to move out and you enter into a new lease, but it's one of those times when the tenancy can end. Then there is at renewal, the tenant has the option not to renew, so they'll notify us that it's ending.
Yeah.
And obviously the not so nice one is when we have to finish a lease because the obligations haven't been met by the tenant. So there's three different times and two instances there that where it ends, and I guess the process is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But basically their obligations is to make sure everything is paid up to date and that they leave the property the way that they found it. So that's where we come back to the making good.
But making good, okay. So that could be quite contentious, I imagine.
It can be quite contentious, and it's very similar to a residential situation because fair wear and tear comes into play, and the length of tenure and all of those sorts of things comes into play, and it's really just working through that. And at the end of the day, there's some money that needs to be paid at the end of the tenancy, and sometimes there's a bond held. That's a little bit different than a residential situation where there's always a bond.
I didn't know that commercial properties could hold bonds.
Commercial property there can be a bond,
but it's not they're not.
It's
like in residential, you have to have a bond, whereas okay. All right, well, I mean, look, that's pretty much, have you got anything else that you would like to tell the good people out there? Or?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay, look, so I think, I mean, that's pretty much the end of my Q&A with James. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We do have a few minutes to answer some Q&A, but before we go on to that, I just again wanted to thank everybody for their attendance. And of course, a reminder that it is recorded. We will be sending you a link to that recording. So let's get into, let's see what kind of, okay, well, here was a question about clarification on OPEX in common areas and how it's split amongst multiple tenants. I think potentially we might have answered that question. As
we have, I guess there's just different bases on how you do that. And I'll give you a little bit of an example. We manage a property of 5 units, they're shops. And so they have their shared common area expenses, which are your normal common area expenses, and they're different size shops. And most of the expenses we've used the basis of square meterage determines their percentage.
Yeah.
And that's the most common way. However, there are some of the shops there that we know, and they all agree, use far more water
because of their processes or whatever, right? Okay.
Than others.
Yeah.
And there's no sub-meters, but everyone's come to an agreement, and they've all admitted, well, yeah, of course I use far more water.
Yeah.
So they've worked out a way to, so we have two different
So there's an agreed upon percentage depending on the usage of
Yeah.
the premises, or they actually look
Yeah.
at square meterage.
Yeah, and like another
Okay.
example that I talked about earlier was the use of a lift
Yeah.
or a common area toilet that's on the first floor, but there's only one tenant up there.
Yeah.
So you've got to work that out.
Right.
So sometimes there can be quite easy. The easiest one obviously is when there's only one tenant. You're 100%.
That's the best one.
Yeah. So I hope that answers that for Jen. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for the informative webinar. James, I wondered how you solved landlord and tenant conflicts. So I think that was really just talking about this dispute process, wasn't it? And that really.
That's obviously a difficult one, and it's probably the most common reason why landlords ask a property manager to manage their property. Is because they don't like that conflict, and it's similar in residential.
Yeah.
So initially, I guess we are messengers. So we're advising a tenant of a situation, and we either get a positive response to that or a negative. So then we're just giving the message of the negative response back to the landlord, and we'll input some suggestions into that.
Based on your experience?
Based on our experience, you know, like a lot of these things we've seen before. So we might have seen them 10 times. Right. And those 10 times, this is how it played out.
Yeah.
So we're able to advise that. And then whichever party disagrees with that might think, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense now. So it's really putting in our experience and trying to resolve it that way. But we have had instances where we've had to meet the tenant and the landlord and just mediate that situation.
Right.
So in residential management, you're able to use that mediation service through tenancy services. Absolutely. And then a tenancy tribunal.
Yeah.
We don't have that advantage or facility in commercial. So it takes somebody that can mediate that and get the parties together and try and work through it. But hey, look, it does occasionally end up in disputes tribunal. We do have the advantage where we can pass it on to solicitors.
Okay. So if none of you can agree,
that's quite common. I know in residential situation, a solicitor is never used.
No, well, we've got the tribunals, so which you guys don't.
But in commercial, that's a big difference. Is landlords and tenants both bring their solicitors in quite often, and that's not necessarily because we wouldn't be able to resolve it. It's just that it's a bit quicker, and it just,
All right, and then our last question here, which is quite an interesting one. So we've spoken about agreement of lease and deed of lease. So Anonymous has asked, what is the point of signing the agreement of lease in the first place? Why wouldn't you just go straight to a deed of lease?
You can, and quite often you do. It's just, it's a little bit like when you buy a property, you they use the sale and purchase agreement, and the real estate agent can fill that out, and it's kind of like, here's my proposal, i.e. this is how much I'm willing to pay for the property. And then it goes backwards and forwards, countersigning. You can use the agreement to lease because it's going to say what rent I want to pay, what terms I want, and you'd be surprised, a lot of tenants will cross out all the outgoings. Especially the management fee, and then so it's just a document that you're able to use, and the landlord can then look over it. The landlord may be relying on their solicitor to give them advice, or their property manager to give them advice, so they can see quite clearly in an agreement to lease what this tenant is actually asking. And then you can countersign it, you can change it, you can countersign it, and then that's kind of like your document that you're not going to renege on until now in the time that you move in. And so it's a bit more binding than just a verbal agreement. But a lot of the time, landlords and tenants come to a verbal agreement or come to an email agreement, and
then draw up the deed.
just go straight to their solicitor and say, can you draw a lease up based on this?
Okay.
The agreement to lease is probably, I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it, but let's just say it's 50% of the time people use agreement to lease. Sometimes people don't use deeds of renewal or deeds of rent reviews, and some people do 100% of the time.
Okay, very good. All right, well, I think that's pretty much us. Again, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. We really hope that you found that informative and has given you a really good overview of commercial. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you again next month at our next webinar.